So welcome to session 1 of a small group video series called On Your Mark, Get Set, Grow. The purpose of this small group is to help participants grow in their understanding of Mark's gospel and his message, to apply it to their lives, and to do it in a safe setting with others. And I'm so thankful that you're participating in this small group. For each small group, I'm going to share a theme of Mark and a short talk. After the small group watches the video, you'll have time for more conversation. Each of the talks in this video will correspond with a sermon that I'll be giving at Chain of Lakes Church, so come to worship to learn more. I think an important question to look at is, why would I even want to learn about Mark's gospel? Well, one of the principles of the Protestant branch of the church is the priesthood of all believers. What this partly means is everyone is encouraged to read the Bible, know the stories, and learn from them, and apply them to their lives. All followers of Jesus can be engaged with their own Bibles. You don't need to be reliant on a person with an REV in front of their name, to engage in the Bible. For me personally, the Bible is the most important book in my life. I read it almost every day. I preach from it often. I've led many Bible studies. If I was stranded on a deserted island and could only have one book, I would want to have this book, my HarperCollins NRSV Study Bible. That's very well used. For me, the Bible is a source of life. What's tragic is many people don't see the Bible as a source of life. It has, the Bible, a history of being misinterpreted. It's been used as a hammer on people instead of this source of life. Also, many people haven't been given the tools to learn from the Bible, so people look at the Bible as confusing. I believe that people want to read the Bible. They want to engage the stories of the Bible, but people haven't been given the tools. There's no reason to be afraid of reading the Bible. If you can read the newspaper, you can read the Bible. Ultimately, by not knowing the Bible, we miss out on knowing the stories of Jesus, the most important person who's ever lived. So we're looking at Mark. Mark is one of the 4 Gospels, and I've heard people ask me before, why does there have to be 4 Gospels? Wouldn't it be easier if there was just one? Why 4 and not 1? Well, actually, a little history. Once there was an attempt to combine all 4 Gospels into one. It was done by a man by the name of Tatian. He lived about between 120 and 185. He tried to take all 4 of the Gospels and combine them into one. He created what the church calls the Diatessaron. Google Tatian or Diatessaron, and you can learn a lot about his fascinating story. However, over time, people came to see that it's just much better to have 4 stories instead of 1. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they each told a unique story about Jesus. And each of their stories are so rich and so unique that to combine them into one story doesn't work. So imagine with me, if you're at home, you have 4 beautiful foods, and you put them into a blender. What do you get? Mush. Right. We lose the distinctiveness of each food. Now think about it. If there was a car crash, and there were 4 different newspaper accounts of the crash, most likely each of the 4 writers would look at something different in the story. One account might emphasize that the cause of the crash happened because of the speed of the car. Another account might look at the design of the road. Another account might look at the driver or the driver's history. Reading these different accounts of the car crash would give us a much rich and broad understanding of what happened. So the same idea applies to the 4 Gospels. When we read 4 accounts about Jesus and his message, we receive a much broader understanding of who Jesus was. Now we're looking at Mark. There's all sorts of interesting information about Mark. I don't know if you knew this, but perhaps you did. Mark is the shortest gospel. It only has 16 chapters. The next longest gospel is John with 20. The longest gospel is Luke with 24. Now, because Mark is the shortest gospel, some people have even memorized it and presented orally with the community. Now, Mark was the first gospel that was written. Most people believe that Matthew and Luke had Mark with them when they wrote their gospels. And if you look at the outline of Matthew and Luke, it follows Mark. Mark, Matthew, and Luke are called synoptic gospels, which means having a common view. Now, because Mark is so short, some people have diminished the importance of Mark. It's really received the least amount of respect among the four gospels. St. Augustine mistakenly believed that Mark was a shorter version of Matthew, and Mark wasn't even included in the gospel readings of the lectionary until 1969. If you read through Mark, you're not going to find a birth story, no Sermon on the Mount, no parable of the Good Samaritan or prodigal son, no Lord's Prayer. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is hardly even mentioned. But over time, Mark has become greatly appreciated. And his message about who Jesus is and the kingdom and following Jesus is very important for our lives. All right, so an important question to ask is, who is Mark? Well, I follow a traditional view. Mark was actually known as John Mark. And if we read through Acts, we'll find two places where he was known as John Mark. John Mark traveled with Paul on Paul's first missionary journey. A later story in Acts 15, shared that John Mark and Paul had a serious disagreement. It was so serious that John Mark and a man by the name of Barnabas went one way and Paul went the other way. They had a split. John Mark has always been associated with Peter. In fact, one writer in the 2nd century shared that John Mark was Peter's interpreter. As we read through his gospel, we'll see that John Mark didn't want to be known. As a narrator, Mark didn't reveal a lot about himself. Luke started out his gospel by sharing that he wanted to write an orderly account of the story of Jesus. John ended his gospel by saying the world itself could not contain the books that could be written about Jesus. You won't find this in Mark. Mark was a silent narrator. People might ask the question, well, when did Mark write his gospel? Well, he wrote it between the years 60 and 75, most likely between the years 68 and 73. This was a time of great chaos in the region where Mark lived. There were serious earthquakes in the years 60 and 63. The Roman army suffered defeat at the hands of the Parthians in the year 62. In the year 64, Roman Christians became scapegoats for a disastrous fire that destroyed much of Rome. Christians were rounded up and put to death in very cruel ways. Peter and Paul were probably killed in this incident. In the year 66, the temple, the source of faith, was burned, and its sacred objects were carried throughout the streets. There was a sense of tremendous tumult. Amidst this chaos, Mark wrote down his story about Jesus, and he started it by writing, the beginning of the good news or gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It's worth knowing that Mark started his story this way. It's even worth memorizing this first verse, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The first chapter in Mark contains many of the themes that we'll find in the book. We receive an answer to the question, who is Jesus? We learn about the kingdom of God. We learn about resistance to God, and we learn what it means to be a follower or disciple of Jesus, all in the first chapter. There's an energy to Mark. He frequently used the word immediately a lot, 27 times, immediately, immediately, immediately. There's an energy that pulsates throughout the gospel. It's as if Mark was saying, let's go, this story is so important that I don't have a lot of time to waste. And there's a mystery to Mark. In Mark, Jesus often told people not to tell others that he was the Messiah. People have called this the Messianic secret. The ending of Mark is one of the most controversial endings of any of the Gospels. Mark is important because it was the first Gospel written. Even more than that, when we study it and learn more about the stories, we can learn what it means to be a follower or disciple of Jesus. It's hard for me to imagine that we could be complete followers of Jesus without knowing the stories of Mark. We will look at all of this during the video series. Ultimately, Mark shares a picture of Jesus that is so compelling that we're still reading it thousands of years later. ultimately, his depiction of the kingdom of God and resistance to the message and what he wrote about the final week of Jesus' life grabs us. And ultimately, the message that Mark shared in a very chaotic time is still relevant for us as we read it in the chaos of our own times. I can't wait for all of us to learn and grow and go deeper as a follower of Jesus through our reading of Mark. On your mark, get set, grow.